Okay, today we're going to talk about the classifications of these fungi. There are 5 phyla, so they're not nearly as bad as our protist. Okay, starting with the first, this is called Tracheidomycota. Now, just FYI, anything that ends in mycota is a fungus because mycology is the study of fungus. If you are someone who goes out and collects mushrooms or truffles or any of the other kind of fungus, excuse me, you're a mycologist. So if it ends in mycota, it's a fungus. So Chytridiomycota are the chytrids, and these are very, very ancient and old. It's our oldest group of fungi. Then Zygomycota, which is probably going to be the only one we'll really talk about today, is our common mold, and it's going to be the mold that grows on food. So you've probably seen the mold that grows on bread. That's what we're going to talk about today. Third, we have our Ascomycota. They're called the sac fungi because they produce their spores in little sacs. Basidiomycota, this is the club fungi. This is the group, or the phylum that has mushrooms. They're also the only phylum that reproduces only through sexual reproduction. And then last, we have Deuteromycota. It's called the imperfect fungi. Sometimes people call them fungi imperfecti, and we'll talk about why they are the imperfect fungus. All right, starting with our chytrids, Chytridiomycota, they are unicellular and they're aquatic. Some of them are saprophytic. Now, going back, a saprophyte is the way the fungus behave. They're saprophytes if they are getting their food only from dead and decaying material. So some of the chytrids are saprophytic, and they have to produce flagellated spores. The spores have to have flagella because they're in water. So in order for spores to join, they're going to have a means of getting towards one another, and that's the way they perform when they're in the water. Now, let me just say a few things about spores. Spores are haploid structures that are formed when the fruiting body releases them into the air. They take on the name of whatever the phylum is. So if we're talking about chytrids, they're chytridiospores. If it is zygote, if it's the black mold on the bread, they're called zygospores. If this is Ascomycota, they're ascospores. If we're talking about mushrooms, that's basidium, they're basidiospores. And then we have the last one, our imperfect fungi, which are called deuterospores. So the spore name just changes with the phylum. So they're not different in their makeup, but if I ask you what the spore of an Ascomycetes is or Ascomycota, then it's going to be an ascospore. So don't get caught up in the difference in spores. They're all the same. They're all haploid. They have half of the information as the adult, but the name just changes. So if I ask you, what the spore is of a mushroom and it's a Basidiomycota, then the spore is going to be a basidiospore. So don't let that confuse you because sometimes these names with fungus, the fungus themselves are not hard, but sometimes the names of the structures of the fungus can sort of bog you down, and I don't want that to happen. All right, we're going to talk about our Zygomycota first. Now, sometimes you see them as Zygomycetes. Mycetes and mycota means the same thing. When I was your age, it wasn't Zygomycota, it was Zygomycetes. So if I slip and say that name, you know I'm talking about the same thing. All right, with Zygomycota, There are common molds. They are multicellular. They are terrestrial. Most of them are terrestrial. Some of them are in the water, but most of them, if not, I would think all of them would be on land. Terrestrial means land. A lot of them form mutualistic relationships with plants. So, as we get into the types of relationships that we have later, we'll find that there are a lot of fungus that form mutualistic relationship with plants, and the plant has to have them to produce the minerals. If there is a mutualistic relationship with a plant, that means they're both benefiting from some portion of what the other's providing. So the plant would be providing the glucose from photosynthesis, and the fungus would be providing the nutrients and the minerals that get broken down after they release their enzymes into the environment. So that's a mutualistic relationship as opposed to a parasitic relationship. All right, now these fungi also reproduce asexually and sexually. Let me just say right here and keep this in mind that this is the way, except for the mushrooms, Basidium mycota, this is the way that the other ones are going to reproduce, both asexually and sexually. In favorable conditions, fungus always reproduce asexually. They just reproduce by releasing their spores. The spores are blown by wind or water or animals. They fall to the ground. And if the conditions are favorable, then you have a new mycelium. If the conditions are not favorable, then they're not going to reproduce asexually, they reproduce sexually. And that means they're going to have haploid mycelia, produce spores that are going to have to go through meiosis and join. Now, when they do this, they usually form some sort of structure that is encased in a really hard covering. It's sort of like a seed that like you buy in the packages, and it allows the spore that's inside to remain in there until conditions are favorable. If conditions are unfavorable, guys, it's probably too hot or too dry because fungus love really, really moist weather and they like a lot of water. So that would be unfavorable if those conditions were not met. And if it's unfavorable, then their spore is going to wall themselves up inside of a tough covering where it can remain for months and months until they are able to encounter favorable conditions and then they can break out. So this is something typical of all fungus that they are capable of reproducing asexually in favorable conditions and sexually in unfavorable. All right, we're going to talk about Rhizopus stolonifer. That is a scientific name for you. And this is our black bread mold.